Hello everyone, welcome to the Mr. Bean Family Story Channel. This is where every day we bring you interesting, fun, and inspiring stories from the Mr. Bean family. You'll meet me, Mr. Bean, someone you're probably already familiar with, and I hope you love my son with his surprising and meaningful stories, and my lovely daughter, who always brings positive energy with stories that are close to life. Each day, one of us will share new stories, exciting journeys, and today is my turn. I'll take you on a fun adventure, but also with deep life lessons. Today's story carries a simple yet important message. Never judge something by its appearance. Behind that appearance, there are always surprising things waiting for us. If you enjoy the lively atmosphere of our family, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any of our stories on this amazing journey. Share this video with your friends, family, and loved ones, and don't forget to leave your fun comments so I know what you think. Now let's dive into today's story and immerse ourselves in a world full of surprises. Let's go! The revolving doors of the Mitchell Grand Hotel spun effortlessly, the sound of soft chimes filling the air as Beth Mitchell stepped inside. It was a world apart from the one she had just left behind. The luxury that surrounded her contrasted sharply with the woman who walked through the entrance. At 32, Beth's quiet confidence was evident in her steady, determined gaze. Though the exhaustion of a long day spent teaching children at her community art program weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had driven nearly 3 hours to get to the hotel, and her body ached in protest. The last thing she wanted was to be in this glittering, imposing lobby. Yet here she was. Her gray, paint-splattered t-shirt, light denim jacket, and worn jeans stood in stark contrast to the opulence around her. The pristine marble floors gleamed under the light of crystal chandeliers, casting golden hues across the lobby, while well-dressed guests mingled near a grand piano, their conversations punctuated by the soft notes of classical music. She felt suddenly self-conscious, adjusting the backpack slung over her shoulder, aware of the dry paint beneath her fingernails. The trucker cap pulled low over her brown ponytail felt like another mark of how out of place she was. Beth had received a call from her husband, Robert, just 30 minutes earlier. He had insisted she stay at his hotel after a long day of work instead of driving another 2 hours to their countryside home. His voice had been warm, comforting, and full of affection, as it always was. "I'll let them know you're coming," he had promised. For a moment, that had seemed like the perfect solution. A night in a comfortable hotel room instead of the long, aching drive home. Still, she felt awkward now, standing in the lavish lobby of the Mitchell Grand, feeling very much like an outsider. The thought that her simple, quiet life as an art teacher had led her here, to this expensive hotel, seemed strange. But Robert had always been clear about their relationship. They would never live by the traditional expectations that came with wealth. She would never be the trophy wife, and he would never ask her to give up her work with children in exchange for the comforts of a luxury life. Beth took a deep breath, pushing her thoughts aside and walked toward the reception desk, where two impeccably dressed employees stood at attention. Their sharp, professional appearance only made her feel more out of place. "Good evening," Beth said, offering a tired but polite smile to the male receptionist, whose name tag read Bradley. "I'm Beth Mitchell. My husband should have called ahead about a room for me." Bradley's gaze swept over her appearance, lingering a moment too long on the trucker cap, the faded jeans, and the backpack slung casually over her shoulder. The professional smile that had initially been directed at her now tightened almost imperceptibly. "Do you have identification, madam?" he asked, his tone a touch skeptical. Beth's heart sank, but she kept her voice steady, replying, "Of course." She dug through her backpack, pulling out her wallet and retrieving her driver's license. "Elizabeth Mitchell," she said, offering it to him. Bradley took the card and examined it with exaggerated care, his brow furrowing slightly as he read it. He glanced briefly at his colleague, Emma, who stood beside him. Emma raised an eyebrow and Bradley's lips pressed together, a subtle exchange of judgment passing between them. "And you say Mr. Mitchell arranged a room for you?" he asked again, the disbelief in his voice now evident. "Yes," Beth replied, her voice unwavering, though she could feel the tension rising. "Robert Mitchell. He owns this hotel." Bradley exchanged another look with Emma, this time more obvious. Emma leaned forward, lowering her voice but still loud enough to be heard by a few guests standing nearby. Ma'am, this is a five-star luxury hotel. Perhaps there's been some confusion? Beth's cheeks flushed with a mix of frustration and embarrassment, but she remained composed. There's no confusion. I am Elizabeth Mitchell, Robert Mitchell's wife. He owns this hotel chain. The lobby had grown quieter as a few nearby guests began to watch the interaction. Their curiosity piqued. The moment stretched out painfully, and Beth could feel all eyes on her. It was as if she were being judged, but for what? Her appearance? Her clothes? She wasn't sure, but she wasn't about to let it go. Of course you are, Bradley said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. And I'm the Queen of England. Emma stepped forward, her professional demeanor slipping ever so slightly, replaced by a cold disdain. Listen, she said, leaning in. We get this occasionally. People think claiming a connection to the Mitchell family will get them special treatment. Beth's lips tightened, but she didn't lose her composure. I'm not claiming anything. I am Elizabeth Mitchell. My husband is Robert Mitchell. He owns this hotel chain. The room felt colder, the air thick with tension. A well-dressed couple nearby had stopped talking, their hushed whispers now a part of the growing spectacle. Bradley's posture seemed to straighten as he noticed their attention, and he grew more confident in his stance. Mrs. Mitchell, Bradley said, emphasizing her name with open disbelief. Mrs. Mitchell is a former model, serves on multiple charity boards, and attended the Met Gala last month. His eyes swept dismissively over Beth's paint-stained jeans and simple t-shirt. Perhaps you'd like to try another establishment, one more suited to your circumstances. Beth felt a flash of indignation, not for herself, but for the countless people who had been judged in this way, by their appearance, their clothes, their status. My husband called ahead. Please check your system, she said firmly, her patience wearing thin. Bradley sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes before making a show of typing on his computer. No reservation under Elizabeth or Beth Mitchell. No note from Mr. Mitchell either, he muttered, looking up at her with a thin, insincere smile. How surprising. Could you call him? Beth asked, maintaining her composure despite the growing humiliation. Please call Mr. Mitchell directly. Emma's laughter was light but condescending. Mr. Mitchell is one of the wealthiest businessmen in America. We don't just call him because someone in a trucker hat claims to be his wife. Beth's eyes narrowed, but she took a deep breath. Then call the manager on duty. Bradley's smile faded completely. That won't be necessary, he replied coldly. We're very busy with actual guests. He gestured dismissively to the growing line behind Beth. The Cozy Inn 6 blocks down might have availability. Beth's blood boiled, but she didn't back down. She stood her ground. I'm not leaving. Her voice was quiet but firm. My husband is Robert Mitchell. This is his hotel, and I'd like to speak to the manager now. Bradley's expression darkened. Security will escort you out if necessary. As if on cue, a security guard, a middle-aged man named Frank, according to his badge, approached. Everything all right here? He asked. Beth's heart raced, but she didn't flinch. She stood tall as Frank turned toward her, a look of discomfort passing across his face. Ma'am, I'll have to ask you to come with me, Frank said. A few of the nearby guests had pulled out their phones, recording the scene. Beth felt the rush of heat in her cheeks, embarrassment, shame. But it wasn't just for herself anymore. She refused to be reduced to a stereotype. I am not causing a disturbance, Beth said clearly. I'm simply trying to check into my husband's hotel after a long day of work. Frank hesitated, his grip on her arm tightening just slightly. Please don't make this difficult, ma'am, he said. Beth shook her head. I want to speak to your general manager. Bradley looked at her with a mix of frustration and disbelief. Richards is at a conference in New York. I'm the most senior staff member on duty. Then call Richard, or better yet, call Robert Mitchell directly, Beth said, her voice unwavering. I guarantee he'll be interested to hear how you're treating his wife. Beth's patience was wearing thin, but she refused to back down. The hotel lobby felt like a stage now, and she was the reluctant star of an unwanted performance. Guests still watched her, some whispering behind raised hands, others openly pulling out their phones to capture the moment. She could feel the weight of their eyes, but she stood firm, refusing to let them see how humiliated she was. Bradley and Emma exchanged glances, their condescension barely masked by their practiced smiles. The tension in the air was thick, the kind of unspoken judgment that came from a place of privilege, an assumption that wealth, status, and appearance were the only measures of worth. And now here was Beth, a woman in paint-stained jeans and a trucker hat, claiming to be the wife of the billionaire owner of the hotel. It was absurd to them. They were certain she didn't belong here. "I'm not leaving until I speak to the manager," Beth said firmly, her voice unwavering. There was no anger in her tone, just a quiet authority. She wasn't about to let them treat her like this. Emma's lip curled slightly as she leaned forward, lowering her voice so that only Beth could hear. "You're causing a scene, and you're making it worse for yourself. Maybe you should just go before things escalate." Beth shook her head, the words stinging, but they didn't rattle her. She was used to fighting for what was right. "I'm not leaving until I've spoken to the person in charge. Call the manager, now." Bradley sighed dramatically and made another show of typing into the computer. "As I said, no reservation under Beth Mitchell or Elizabeth Mitchell," he repeated, though this time his voice was sharper. "There's nothing here. Nothing from Mr. Mitchell either." Beth's eyes never left his. "If you're not going to help me, then you can call security or the general manager. I'll wait. I'll wait as long as it takes." As the words left her mouth, the lobby had grown quieter. It wasn't just the employees and a few guests who were listening now. A sense of discomfort hung in the air as more and more people began to pay attention, sensing that something wasn't right. A few patrons glanced at one another, their whispers growing louder. The whole scene felt as if it were spiraling, but Beth held her ground. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for dignity, for herself, and for anyone else who had ever been dismissed or judged based on how they looked. Emma's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, leaning back into her professional stance. "Ma'am, this is a 5-star establishment," she said, her voice rising just slightly. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Beth's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Yes, I'm sure. I'm in the right place." Bradley's expression was beginning to show signs of frustration. His hands hovered over the keyboard, but he didn't seem to want to type anything else. Instead, he met her gaze with increasing annoyance. "You're wasting my time," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You really should try somewhere else." Beth took a deep breath, doing her best to keep her composure. This was a test, and she wasn't going to fail it. "Call the manager, Bradley. Call Robert Mitchell. I assure you, he will be very interested in how you're treating his wife." Bradley's face turned red, his frustration clearly mounting as he finally slammed his hand down on the desk. "I'm not calling Mr. Mitchell," he snapped. "You're wasting everyone's time, ma'am." He turned to Emma, signaling for her to back him up. "We need to get rid of this disruption." Beth remained calm, though the muscles in her jaw tightened. She wasn't just fighting for her dignity anymore. She was fighting for everyone who'd ever been dismissed because they didn't look the part. "I'm not leaving," she repeated, her voice firm but quiet. "I want to speak to your manager or to Robert Mitchell directly." Emma's gaze hardened as she stepped forward, the mask of professionalism now fully replaced by contempt. "You don't get it, do you?" she hissed, her words low but clear. "We don't serve your kind here. People like you don't belong in places like this." Beth froze. The words stung, but they weren't new. She had heard them before, and she wasn't about to let them break her now. The tension in the lobby seemed to escalate as more guests looked on, a collective gasp rising from a few of them. Some shook their heads, others watched in silence, all witnessing the unfolding cruelty. "My kind?" Beth repeated quietly, though the fire in her chest began to burn hotter. "What kind is that?" "The kind that comes here pretending to be someone they're not," Emma shot back, her voice dripping with disdain. "People who think they deserve luxury just because they claim some connection to it." Beth could feel the heat of her anger rising, but she pressed on, refusing to let them provoke her further. "I am not pretending to be anyone. I am Elizabeth Mitchell. My husband is Robert Mitchell. He owns this hotel chain. Now I will wait for him, or I will wait for the manager." Emma's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension in the room. Is there a problem here? All eyes turned toward the entrance. Robert Mitchell stepped into the lobby, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed back, exuding a quiet authority that made the already tense atmosphere even more palpable. Beth's heart skipped a beat when she saw him. She had known he would come, but the sight of him here, in the midst of this chaos, made everything feel surreal. Her relief was immediate, though she didn't allow herself to show it. Robert's sharp gaze swept over the scene. Beth standing tall but humiliated, the reception staff frozen behind the counter, the growing crowd of onlookers, and the security guard, Frank, who had been assigned to escort her out. Robert's eyes met Beth's, and for a brief moment, she saw the soft concern in his expression before it hardened into something much more commanding. He made his way toward the front desk with deliberate steps, his presence drawing all attention. "Excuse me," Robert said, his voice low but carrying an edge that immediately silenced the room. "Is there a problem here?" He directed the question at Frank, the security guard. Frank's face turned pale as he stammered. "Mr. Mitchell, sir, I—" "Let go of my wife," Robert interrupted calmly, his voice ice cold. Frank immediately released his grip on Beth's arm, taking a step back as though burned by her touch. Robert turned to Bradley, his expression one of quiet, controlled anger. "You have something to explain to me," he said, his eyes never leaving the receptionist. Bradley, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment, opened his mouth to speak but faltered, unsure of how to respond. "We didn't recognize Mrs. Mitchell, sir," he began, but the words were weak and shaky, lacking the conviction they had when they first started this ordeal. Robert's gaze hardened. "You didn't recognize her?" he repeated, the disbelief in his voice cutting through the air. "So you decided to call security and have her escorted out?" Beth could see the shift in Robert's demeanor, his usual calm and collected nature now replaced by a palpable intensity. "Do you know who you're talking to?" he asked, his voice rising just enough to make it clear he was no longer going to tolerate the disrespect. The receptionist's face went pale as he realized the full extent of the mistake they had made. A few nearby guests whispered, exchanging glances, clearly shocked by what was unfolding. Beth stood quietly by Robert's side, a silent but steady presence. She felt no need to speak anymore. Robert was handling this. The lobby had fallen into a stunned silence, with every eye fixed on Robert Mitchell as he stood by his wife's side. His presence was commanding, his posture regal, but it was the cold fury in his eyes that held the crowd's attention. Robert turned his gaze back to Bradley, the receptionist, who was visibly sweating now, his hands trembling as he tried to gather himself. "You didn't recognize her?" Robert's voice was low, controlled, but it cut through the air with the force of a sharp blade. "So your solution was to humiliate my wife in front of all these guests? To call security and drag her out like she doesn't belong here?" Bradley swallowed hard, his face pale. We didn't mean to cause any trouble, sir," he stammered. "It was just that, well, Mrs. Mitchell didn't fit the profile we're used to. People often claim to be connected to the Mitchell family, and we need to be cautious." Robert's gaze narrowed, and for a moment, the tension in the room seemed to stretch on forever. The silence felt heavy, and every word exchanged felt like it was being scrutinized under a microscope. "Didn't fit the profile," Robert repeated slowly, as if testing the words. His voice remained calm, but the ice in his tone made it clear he was far from satisfied. "What does that mean exactly? What kind of profile are we talking about here, Bradley?" The receptionist was floundering now, unable to provide a satisfactory answer. "I—" Bradley began, his voice faltering as he looked desperately for words. But the reality of the situation was dawning on him. He had made a mistake, a big one, and he had no idea how to fix it. Emma, still standing nearby, had gone completely silent. She avoided Robert's gaze, her earlier smugness replaced by a deep sense of discomfort. She knew this wasn't just an ordinary customer complaint. It was a direct challenge to the culture she had been part of, and it was crumbling before her eyes. Robert's eyes flicked to Emma, and she stiffened under his gaze. "Emma," he said, his voice still deceptively calm. "You knew about this, didn't you? You didn't just stand by and let it happen? You participated in it. Emma opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out. She felt trapped, and she could see in Robert's eyes that there was no way out of this. Her mistake had been too big, too public. Beth, standing quietly at Robert's side, felt the heat of the moment, but she didn't speak. This wasn't her fight to finish, not anymore. Robert was taking control now. He had always been a man of principle, and his actions spoke louder than any words could. Robert turned back to Bradley, the silence between them thick. He took a step closer, his presence making the younger man shrink even further. I founded Mitchell Luxury Properties with the belief that every guest, every person, deserves respect, no matter how they look, no matter where they come from. Bradley winced, knowing full well that his actions had undermined everything Robert stood for. I'm sorry, sir, he mumbled, his voice cracking under the weight of his own guilt. You should be, Robert replied, his voice suddenly more resolute. And if you truly understood what it means to respect others, you wouldn't need me to tell you how wrong your behavior was. But I'm going to make sure you understand. There was a moment of stillness as everyone waited for what Robert would say next. Even the security guard, Frank, who had been standing in the background, seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold. Robert stood for a moment, letting the gravity of his words settle in the air. He wasn't finished yet, and the tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for his next move. He slowly turned to face the other staff members who had been silently observing the confrontation. Bradley, Emma, Frank, Robert began, his voice steady, yet laced with the weight of authority. This hotel was built on the values of exceptional service and respect for everyone who walks through these doors, and you, he paused, his gaze sweeping over each of them, have completely forgotten that. I'm deeply disappointed. The room felt smaller with each word Robert spoke, his voice sharp and measured. You've been given an opportunity to serve people, not just because of their wealth, but because they deserve to be treated with dignity. And you failed. Beth remained silent, but she stood tall beside him, her quiet strength radiating as she listened to Robert's words. She wasn't angry anymore. Not at him, not at the staff. Instead, she felt a sense of pride. She knew Robert would do what was right, not just for her, but for everyone who had been judged based on their appearance or status. Robert continued, his voice unwavering. There's a right way to handle a situation like this, and it's not by assuming someone doesn't belong here simply because they don't look like what you expect. It's not about dress codes or social status. It's about recognizing the humanity in each person. He turned to Bradley. You're in a position of responsibility. Your job is to serve, not to make assumptions. Bradley shifted uneasily under Robert's gaze, his face flushed with shame. Sir, I didn't mean... I know what you meant, Robert cut him off, but it doesn't matter. What matters is how you treated my wife, and how you treated everyone who's ever been judged for the same reasons. He took a deep breath, calming himself. You won't be fired, but you will be held accountable. Beth could see the change in the room. The staff members, once confident in their dismissal of her, were now visibly rattled. Emma, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up, her voice hesitant. Mr. Mitchell, I'm sorry, I didn't realize what I was doing. I was just trying to uphold the standards we're trained for. Standards, Robert echoed, his voice soft but laced with an edge. The only standard that matters is treating people with respect. Every guest, every person, deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of how they appear or where they come from. He turned toward Frank, the security guard, who had been quietly standing by during the entire exchange. Frank, security is here to protect guests, not intimidate them. You're part of a team that is meant to welcome and ensure safety, not make anyone feel inferior. Do you understand? Frank nodded, his face reddening as he stood straighter. Yes, Mr. Mitchell. I understand. Robert's gaze softened slightly, his disappointment still evident, but now tinged with a sense of resolve. Good. We'll be implementing new training programs starting tomorrow. You will all be involved in them, and you'll see firsthand the impact of these biases on people. Emma opened her mouth, clearly hesitant. But sir, what if... Robert raised a hand to stop her. No buts, Emma. This isn't up for debate. We're going to change how things work here, and it starts with you." Beth's heart swelled with emotion as she saw the sincerity in Robert's eyes. This was about something bigger than just her. This was about creating real change in a place that had allowed prejudice to thrive unnoticed for too long. Robert wasn't just standing up for her. He was standing up for anyone who had ever been made to feel less than. Turning to the three staff members once more, Robert's voice softened just slightly. "Tomorrow, we're having a meeting to restructure our customer service training, and you will all be the first to participate in it. This is your chance to understand the consequences of your actions and to learn how to truly serve." Bradley, Emma, and Frank exchanged uncertain glances, each of them fully aware of the responsibility they now faced. They were no longer just employees. They were part of a process that could either lead to personal growth or to permanent failure. Finally, Robert turned to Beth, his expression softening into something that only she could read. "Let's go, honey. This is over now." As they made their way to the elevator, Beth couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of hope. The change wasn't just about the hotel. It was about making the world a better place, one small step at a time. As the doors closed behind them, she knew that this was only the beginning. The next morning, the Mitchell Grand Hotel hummed with an unusual energy. There was an air of expectation, mixed with uncertainty, as the staff prepared for the first day of the new training program. It was no longer business as usual. The hotel's pristine marble floors and golden chandeliers seemed to gleam a little more brightly today. But the change wasn't just cosmetic. In Robert's private office, he sat at his desk, flipping through notes on the changes he'd requested. The hotel's leadership would be receiving the most significant shakeup in years, and this new training program was just the beginning. Robert had always been a man of action, and this was no different. His thoughts were still on the conversation from the previous night. He had spent hours going over every aspect of how to address the growing culture of bias and disrespect. He had seen enough of it to know that nothing less than a complete overhaul would work. The staff would have to understand that respect for each person, no matter their appearance, was non-negotiable. Beth sat next to him, quietly looking out the window at the city below. She wasn't one for grand gestures or speeches, but seeing Robert take charge of the situation made her heart swell with pride. This was the man she had fallen in love with, someone who cared deeply about fairness and equality, who was willing to risk everything to make things right. "I've been thinking about how to approach this," Robert said, breaking the silence. "The program isn't just about understanding biases. It's about creating a shift in mindset. It has to start with the leadership. If the leaders don't change, the rest of the staff won't either." Beth nodded, her gaze still focused on the bustling city. "You're right. It's about leading by example. If they see you taking a stand, they'll follow." She paused for a moment, her thoughts shifting. But it's not going to be easy. Some people don't change overnight. Robert leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. "No, it won't be easy, but change never is. What we saw last night, it's just the tip of the iceberg. There are more people who need to be reached, more hearts that need to be touched. This training is the first step, but it's going to take time, persistence, and constant reinforcement." Just then, Robert's phone rang, breaking the conversation. He glanced at the screen, then answered with a quick, decisive tone. "Yes?" His face tightened as he listened to the person on the other end. It was the head of HR, calling to confirm the details of the training session. Robert's eyes narrowed as he spoke, outlining the expectations for the day. When he hung up, he turned back to Beth, his expression serious. "This is going to be bigger than just one session. I've got the entire HR team working on a full review of our hiring practices, our promotion processes, and how we assess performance. If we're going to change the culture here, we need to start with the foundation." Beth smiled, impressed by Robert's commitment. "It's going to be a lot of work," she said softly. "I know," Robert replied, "but it's the only way forward." As the morning unfolded, the hotel staff gathered in the conference room for the first of many mandatory training sessions. The air was thick with nervous energy. Some employees were eager to prove themselves, while others bristled at the idea of change. They had always worked in the polished comfort of the Mitchell Grand, where guests were treated with the highest level of luxury and respect. But the events of the previous night had made it clear that their standards were far from flawless. Beth stood at the back of the room, observing quietly. She had been a part of the planning process for the new training, but Robert had asked her to step back and let the professionals handle the execution. It wasn't her style to be in the spotlight anyway, but she still felt an overwhelming sense of pride as she watched the employees file into the room. Robert stood at the front, his posture commanding, as he looked over the group of staff members who had been assigned to the session. Their faces were a mixture of guilt, defensiveness, and curiosity, but he wasn't concerned with their initial reactions. This was about changing deeply ingrained behaviors, and that would take time. "Good morning, everyone." Robert's voice broke the silence as he addressed the group. "I know some of you are uncomfortable with what happened last night. Some of you may feel embarrassed, others may feel defensive, but I want to make one thing clear. This isn't just about one incident. This is about a culture that we, as a team, need to address. What happened last night, what happened to my wife, was wrong. But it's not just about her. It's about everyone who has ever walked through our doors and been judged based on their appearance, their status, or their clothes. We're here today to start changing that." Robert's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. A few staff members exchanged uneasy glances, but Robert wasn't about to let them off the hook. He continued, his voice steady and resolute. "This isn't about punishment. This is about growth, about understanding. I'm asking you to be open to this process. You're going to be uncomfortable, but that discomfort is necessary if we want to make real change." Beth could see the walls coming down, bit by bit. The hard expressions on some faces softened slightly as the staff began to take in Robert's words. This wasn't a lecture. It was an invitation to evolve. And while the road ahead would be difficult, it was clear that Robert wasn't backing down. The session continued with a deep dive into unconscious bias, exploring how even the most well-intentioned individuals could unknowingly harbor prejudices. Beth had worked in community programs long enough to know how powerful these conversations could be, but she also understood how difficult they were. It was one thing to recognize biases intellectually. It was another to confront them in yourself and in your workplace. As the morning wore on, Robert introduced various interactive exercises. He didn't want the session to feel like a lecture. He wanted it to be an honest conversation, one where everyone felt like they could share their experiences and learn from one another. The goal was clear: to create a space where employees didn't just think about change, they felt it. By the time the session was nearing its end, there was a noticeable shift in the room. Some of the more defensive employees had started to ask questions, while others shared their own experiences of feeling judged or overlooked in the past. The conversation grew more real, more vulnerable. It was still uncomfortable, but it was a start. Robert wrapped up the session with a challenge. "This isn't over. Today is just the beginning. I'm asking each of you to reflect on what you've learned today and think about how you can contribute to making this hotel a place where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. That's the standard we're holding ourselves to now." Beth stood in the back of the room, feeling a swell of emotion as she watched the transformation unfold. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was a beginning, a real one. As the employees filed out, some of them lingering to ask questions or thank Robert, Beth caught his eye. She could see the weight of the day on his face, but also the determination. "We're just getting started," he said quietly to her as they walked toward the elevator together. She smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't expected. "And it's going to be worth it," she replied, her voice soft but confident. The next few days at the Mitchell Grand Hotel were filled with subtle but noticeable changes. The staff had been through the first round of training, and though it was clear that not all of them were fully comfortable with the new approach, there was a shift in the atmosphere. The cold, distant professionalism that had once defined the hotel was being replaced by a tentative warmth. Employees, once rigid in their roles, now seemed to take a moment longer to listen, to really see the people they were serving. Beth observed the changes from the background, as she had promised Robert. She didn't want to be the one to lead the charge. This was Robert's vision, his initiative. But she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of hope as she saw the reception desk staff make eye contact with guests. Their smiles just a little bit more genuine, their greetings warmer. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One morning, as Beth sat in the lounge sipping coffee, she watched as one of the hotel's longtime employees, Maggie, greeted a guest at the door. Maggie had always been a professional, but her demeanor had often been a bit stiff, especially with those she deemed less worthy of the hotel's luxury. Today, though, there was a softness in her approach, a subtle change in how she interacted with the guest. Beth watched Maggie laugh gently at something the guest said, her eyes softening as she made a comment about the weather, a conversation that had no agenda other than to connect. Beth could see it. Maggie was starting to change, starting to recognize the humanity in the guests she served, not just the wealth they brought with them. The shift wasn't just happening with the front of house staff. Even the kitchen staff had started to adopt a more open attitude. Beth had overheard one of the chefs, David, chatting with a server about a dish he was preparing for a new guest. His tone had been less about the precision of the recipe and more about how the dish would make the guest feel, something that, a few weeks ago, would have seemed completely out of place in the fast-paced, high-stakes kitchen environment. Despite these small victories, the hotel was far from perfect. It was a process, a gradual evolution that had only just begun. The staff was still working through their discomfort and their biases, but Beth could see the effort in their eyes, the willingness to try, and for now that was enough. While progress was being made, the road to change was never going to be smooth. There were moments when the old habits resurfaced, like an uninvited guest refusing to leave. One afternoon, Beth witnessed a moment of tension that reminded her just how fragile the change was. A family had arrived at the hotel, a middle-class family with young children. The father wore a simple polo shirt, his hair a little too messy for the sleek surroundings of the Mitchell Grand. His children were in matching outfits, the kind of clothes that suggested a modest budget, not the high-end fashion expected in luxury spaces. As they approached the front desk, the receptionist, Claire, gave a quick once-over to the father's attire. Beth watched as the brief flicker of judgment passed through Claire's eyes before she forced a professional smile. There was a slight hesitation in the way Claire spoke to the family, and Beth knew exactly what was going on. It was subtle, but it was there, a moment of discomfort that came from deeply ingrained biases. Claire led them to their room, but the interaction lingered in the air, making Beth uneasy. She knew that change wasn't instantaneous, and she understood the complexity of trying to uproot years of learned behavior. But this moment was a reminder of how much work was still to be done. Claire hadn't acted out of malice. She simply didn't see this family as fitting the mold of the typical luxury guest. Later that day, Beth brought the incident to Robert's attention. "We've come a long way, but we're not there yet," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I saw Claire's hesitation earlier. She's trying, but she's still judging guests based on how they look." Robert listened carefully, his brow furrowed. "I saw it too," he admitted. "It's going to take time. It's not just the staff, it's the whole system. We've built a culture where people who don't fit a certain image are treated differently. We need to make that invisible barrier disappear." Beth nodded, feeling the weight of their shared understanding. "It's about more than just training. It's about showing them how to see people, not just the image they project." Robert's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he considered the challenge. "You're right. I'll have a conversation with Claire. We can't let those moments slide by." The conversation with Claire was one of many steps Robert had taken in the days that followed. He spoke directly with the staff, not just about following the training guidelines, but about truly internalizing the lessons. It was clear that this wasn't just a corporate initiative, it was a personal commitment. Robert wasn't simply changing the way the hotel operated, he was asking every employee to change the way they viewed the world. As the days turned into weeks, the changes became more noticeable. Guests were being treated with more openness, and the staff began to take greater pride in their work. The conversations between employees shifted, from discussing how to meet expectations to asking how they could exceed them. The hotel was still the same in many ways, but now it had a soul, a purpose that went beyond luxury to include humanity. Beth watched as this transformation unfolded, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for Robert's vision. They had started a ripple, and though it would take time to see the full impact, it was undeniable that the hotel and the people working there were becoming something greater than they had ever been. As Beth and Robert stood together in the lobby one evening, watching the guests come and go, Robert spoke quietly, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. This isn't just about making a hotel a better place. It's about making the world a little better, one step at a time. Beth smiled, her heart swelling with pride. It's already working, Robert. As the weeks went by, the changes at the Mitchell Grand Hotel began to take root in ways that were both subtle and significant. Guests seemed to notice the shift immediately, their reactions a mixture of surprise and appreciation. There was a newfound openness among the staff, a warmth that hadn't been there before. The lobby, once a sterile space where transactions were made without a second glance, now buzzed with genuine interactions between employees and guests. One afternoon, Beth stood at the entrance, watching the flow of guests coming and going. It was clear that things had improved, but she also knew that real, lasting change required more than just a few positive interactions. She had seen the hard work her husband had put in, the way he had made it clear to the staff that their behavior mattered, not just to him, but to the future of the hotel. It was a culture shift, not just a corporate policy. Yet not everyone was immediately on board with the transformation. Terry, a senior manager who had worked at the hotel for over 10 years, had always prided himself on his no-nonsense approach to luxury service. He had been one of the most vocal skeptics during the training, and even now, after several weeks of the new policies, he was still unsure. Beth had observed him with concern on more than one occasion, as he greeted guests with a warm smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His discomfort was palpable, and it was clear he was still clinging to the old way of doing things. One day, a family checked in, two parents with three children in tow, clearly excited about their stay at the hotel. The mother was dressed in a simple sundress, and the father wore a casual shirt and khakis. They were friendly and eager, but when Terry greeted them at the front desk, his expression tightened for a brief moment. It was as if he had mentally sized them up and decided they didn't belong in the luxury space the hotel provided. His voice was polite but distant, and he quickly handed them off to a less experienced staff member to complete the check-in. Beth noticed it right away. Her eyes narrowed, and she exchanged a glance with Robert, who was standing a few feet away, watching the scene unfold. He hadn't missed the interaction either. "That wasn't right," Beth murmured quietly to Robert. Robert's jaw clenched. He nodded, his expression tight. "It's a work in progress." But Beth knew that small moments like this, unnoticed by most but felt by those involved, were the cracks that threatened to undermine everything they had worked for. The following morning, Robert called Terry into his office. Beth was sitting nearby, reviewing some reports when Terry entered, his posture rigid and his face betraying a hint of unease. He had been with the Mitchell Grand for over a decade, and he was used to Robert's no-nonsense attitude. But this was different. This wasn't just a conversation about business. It was about culture, and Robert wasn't about to let it slide. "Terry," Robert began, his voice calm but firm, "I noticed your interaction with the Williams family yesterday. I've asked you to lead by example, to embody the changes we're trying to make here. But that moment wasn't it." Terry shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flicking briefly to Beth before focusing back on Robert. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir. I greeted them just like any other guest." "Did you?" Robert's voice didn't raise, but the intensity of his gaze was enough to make Terry feel like he was under a spotlight. "Did you really see them? Or did you size them up based on how they looked? Their clothes? Did you treat them like the luxury guests they are? Or did you let your biases affect your approach?" Terry's face flushed slightly, and he looked down, unable to meet Robert's eyes for a moment. "I didn't mean to, Robert. It's just, well, we've always had a certain standard for who stays here." Beth could feel the weight of the moment as it hung in the air. Robert was quiet for a long moment, and Terry fidgeted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the growing silence. Finally, Robert spoke again, his voice softer now. "The standard isn't about how much money someone has or what they're wearing," Robert said, his tone more measured. "It's about how we treat people. Every single person who walks through that door deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." I thought we had made that clear. Beth could see the internal struggle playing out on Terry's face. He was a professional, yes, but like many longtime employees, He was finding it difficult to let go of the old ways. The ways that had built the hotel into the institution it was today. Ways that now seemed outdated and out of touch with what Robert and Beth were trying to create. I understand, Terry said after a long pause. I've been here a long time, and it's hard to change some things. But I'll do better. Robert nodded, leaning back in his chair. I know you will. We're all learning here. But the important thing is that we don't just talk about change, we live it. Every day. Beth felt a wave of relief wash over her as Terry seemed to accept Robert's words. She had seen the man's resistance before, but now it looked like he was starting to understand that change wasn't just a matter of compliance. It was about embracing a new way of thinking. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but this was a crucial turning point. As Terry stood to leave, Robert added one last thing. Remember, Terry, it's not just about the guests, it's about the entire team. Treating everyone, no matter their role, with the same respect you want to show our guests. That's the standard we're setting. Terry gave a small nod before he left the office, and Beth turned to Robert. You handled that well, she said, her voice full of quiet admiration. Robert let out a slow breath, his face softening. It's not easy, but it's necessary. Beth looked out the window, the weight of the task ahead settling into her chest. It's a long road, but we're on the right path. People are starting to see the difference. Robert smiled, his arm slipping around her waist as they stood together. We'll get there. Together. Despite the initial successes of the new training program, there were still days when the old habits tried to creep back in. Robert and Beth were well aware that the journey of transforming the culture of the Mitchell Grand Hotel was far from complete. Change, as they both knew, was not a one-time event. It was an ongoing process that required constant attention and adaptation. It was during a busy Thursday afternoon, when the hotel was packed with guests, that Robert noticed the first signs of resistance. Maggie, one of the more experienced front desk employees who had shown improvement during the early training sessions, seemed to revert to her old ways when a high-profile guest arrived. The man, wearing a well-tailored suit and carrying a briefcase, entered with an air of confidence. However, it wasn't his appearance that caused the issue. It was his dismissive attitude toward the staff. Maggie greeted him with a smile, but it was clear from the moment she spoke to him that he wasn't exactly keen on engaging with someone who didn't fit his image of high status. As Robert watched from a distance, he saw Maggie's expression change, a small but noticeable shift toward unease. She was no longer the confident, open employee she had become in recent weeks. Instead, she seemed hesitant, unsure of herself, and unwilling to push past the man's cold demeanor. Robert's eyes narrowed as he observed Maggie's behavior. It was frustrating. She had come so far, and now it was clear that the old attitudes were still lingering beneath the surface. Beth, who had been standing beside Robert, noticed the same thing. She leaned in and whispered, "We've got to address this again, don't we?" Robert nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "Yes, but it's not just about Maggie. It's about all of us. We're still teaching people to see others for who they truly are, not what they appear to be." Beth's heart ached a little, watching as Maggie struggled to maintain the warmth and openness they had worked so hard to instill. Robert had been right when he said that change wasn't easy. It wasn't just about changing the system, it was about changing deeply ingrained ways of thinking. But there was hope, too. This was just another test, a sign that they had to keep pushing forward, no matter how difficult it got. The rest of the day passed in a blur of check-ins, room assignments, and the usual flurry of activity that came with managing a luxury hotel. Robert and Beth stayed quiet, observing from the sidelines. Every interaction, every smile, every hesitant moment was under their watchful eyes. They both understood that these moments were crucial. The smallest gesture, whether it was a smile that didn't reach the eyes or a dismissive glance, could either build or break the culture they were trying to create. Later that afternoon, Robert called Maggie into his office. The conversation was inevitable, but Robert knew it had to happen. When she walked in, he could see the weariness in her eyes, as if she knew what was coming, but wasn't sure how to face it. "Maggie," Robert began, his voice calm but direct, "I noticed something today. I saw how you interacted with a guest earlier, and it seemed like you were holding back. Can you tell me what happened?" Maggie shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. She avoided his gaze for a moment before speaking. I don't know, Robert. I guess I just didn't want to make him uncomfortable. He was a big client, and he wasn't exactly the most friendly. I thought maybe I should just let it go. Robert's eyes softened, understanding the pressure she was under. He had seen the same hesitancy in many of the staff members. It was a natural reaction to revert back to old habits when faced with someone who didn't seem to fit the mold of the ideal guest. But that wasn't the standard they were working to uphold. Maggie, Robert said gently, this is exactly what we're trying to change. We can't let people's behavior, whether it's a guest or a coworker, dictate how we treat them. Your job is to offer the same level of respect, the same level of kindness, to every person who walks through that door, regardless of how they act or how they look. Maggie nodded slowly, clearly taking in his words. I understand. It's hard. You see someone acting like that, and you think maybe they don't deserve the same treatment. But I know that's not right. Robert smiled, his expression warm. It's not easy, and it won't happen overnight. But that's why we're doing this, to change the way we think, to recognize that every person has value, regardless of how they come across. Maggie sat quietly for a moment, and then her expression brightened slightly. I'll try harder. I don't want to go back to how I was before. I really do believe in what we're doing here. Robert nodded. I know you do, and I'm proud of the progress you've made so far. This is a journey for all of us. Just remember, it's okay to make mistakes, but it's what we do next that matters. As Maggie left the office, Robert turned to Beth, who had been quietly observing the conversation from the other side of the room. She gave him a small smile, proud of how he had handled the situation. You're right, Beth said softly. It's all about consistency. It's not just about one bad interaction. It's about how we respond and how we keep reinforcing the message. Robert nodded thoughtfully. Exactly. We have to keep reinforcing it, day after day, and eventually it'll sink in. The small changes add up. Beth looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude. I believe in this, Robert. I believe in the change we're making. As they stood together, watching the hotel bustle with activity, it was clear that the work was far from done. But for the first time, it felt like they were heading in the right direction, toward a future where every guest, every employee, was treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. As the months passed, the Mitchell Grand Hotel continued to evolve. The changes Robert and Beth had worked so hard to implement were becoming ingrained in the fabric of the hotel. It wasn't just a shift in policy anymore. It was a shift in culture. Every department, from the front desk to housekeeping, to the kitchen and the management team, had adapted to the new standard of inclusivity and respect. It was a work in progress, but it was starting to feel like a new era for the hotel. Guests, too, seemed to notice the difference. Many of them had stayed at the Mitchell Grand before, and they could tell that something had changed. It wasn't just the service, though the service was better. It was the atmosphere. There was a warmth in the air now, a sense that the people who worked there weren't just performing their jobs. They were invested in the experience, in making every guest feel seen and valued. One particularly busy weekend, the hotel was hosting a high-profile charity gala. The ballroom was transformed into a glittering display of elegance, filled with the city's elite. Robert had always been involved in the hotel's charitable efforts, and this event was a chance to raise funds for the underprivileged children's art program that Beth ran. Beth had been preparing for the event for weeks, overseeing every detail from the decorations to the auction items. It was her passion, and it was one of the main reasons Robert had fallen in love with her in the first place. Despite the grandeur of the event, Beth had insisted on keeping the focus on the children and their creativity, not on the luxury of the hotel. As guests began arriving, the staff was on high alert, ensuring that everything went smoothly. However, not everyone was as comfortable with the changes as others. Emma, who had been a part of the initial training but still carried some old habits, was overseeing the guest arrivals. She greeted each person with a professional smile, but when a young couple entered, dressed simply, the woman in a modest dress and the man in a suit that wasn't quite as expensive as some of the others, Emma's smile faltered for just a moment. Beth, standing near the entrance, noticed the brief hesitation and the slight shift in Emma's demeanor. It wasn't as blatant as it used to be, but it was still there. She made her way over to Emma, who was standing with the young couple, her professional mask back in place. "Everything all right here?" Beth asked, her voice casual but laced with curiosity. Emma quickly adjusted, flashing her smile again. "Yes, Mrs. Mitchell. Everything is going smoothly." Beth could tell Emma was doing her best, but the old biases were still lurking beneath the surface. It was a reminder that the work wasn't over. Even after all the training, even after all the conversations, the internal changes were still something that had to be worked on every day. As the evening wore on, the gala unfolded beautifully. Guests mingled in the lavish ballroom, champagne flutes clinking, and soft music playing in the background. Beth stood near the stage, her heart full as she watched the children she worked with stand proudly at their art stations. Their paintings, sculptures, and drawings were on display, showcasing their raw talent and creativity. This to her was what mattered most: the children's ability to express themselves, to find a voice in a world that often overlooked them. Robert stood beside her, his usual composed demeanor replaced with a look of pride as he watched Beth interact with the children. She was in her element, and it was clear how much she meant to those kids. He could feel the weight of the changes they had both fought for settling in his chest. The new culture of the hotel wasn't just about treating guests with respect. It was about making a real, lasting impact on the community. He had always believed in the power of business to do good, but seeing the children's faces tonight made him realize just how much they could accomplish if they continued on this path. As the evening drew to a close, a speech was made by the guest of honor, a philanthropist who had been instrumental in funding the art program. The crowd applauded as the final notes of music echoed through the room, and Robert stood at the back, watching the interaction between Beth and the young couple from earlier. Beth had invited them to the event as part of her outreach, and they had been quietly taking in the art displays. When the young woman turned to Beth, her eyes bright with gratitude, she said, "Thank you so much for this opportunity. We never imagined something like this. Our daughter has always loved art, but we couldn't afford to send her to a program. Now we can see what she's capable of. This means everything to us." Beth smiled warmly, her heart swelling. "It means everything to me, too. Your daughter has so much potential, and we're just getting started. I'm so glad you could be here tonight." Robert watched the exchange, and for a brief moment, he felt a rush of emotion. This was what they had been working for all along. It wasn't just about the hotel, it was about creating something meaningful, something that could help change lives. As the last of the guests began to leave, Robert and Beth stood together, their hands intertwined, surveying the ballroom one final time. They had both poured so much into this evening, and while they were tired, they were also filled with a deep sense of accomplishment. The hotel was changing, slowly but surely. "Tonight was a success," Robert said quietly, his voice full of pride. "Not just for the gala, but for everything we've been working for. It feels like we're on the right track." Beth nodded, squeezing his hand. "We are, one step at a time." They watched as the staff began to clean up, their energy now infused with a sense of pride and purpose. Even Emma, who had seemed uncertain just hours earlier, was now working with a renewed sense of commitment. The change wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was spreading. Robert turned to Beth, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "I'm proud of you, you know that?" Beth smiled back, her eyes soft with affection. "I couldn't have done it without you." As they walked out of the ballroom together, the future of the Mitchell Grand Hotel seemed brighter than ever. The changes they had worked so hard to create were no longer just ideas or aspirations. They were becoming a reality. And this was only the beginning. As the weeks passed, the changes Robert and Beth had initiated continued to take hold at the Mitchell Grand Hotel. Staff members were adjusting to the new culture, and while the transformation was still in progress, it was becoming clear that the hotel was on a path of real and lasting change. The guests, too, were starting to notice. Reviews started pouring in, and while many praised the luxurious atmosphere and impeccable service, there was a consistent undercurrent of appreciation for the warmth and kindness that now permeated the hotel. However, despite these positive signs, there were still significant hurdles to overcome. Some employees, especially those who had been with the hotel for years, were struggling with the new expectations. The shift wasn't just about learning new skills, it was about changing long-held attitudes, and that was far from easy. One afternoon, Robert met with his management team to discuss the progress and challenges they had encountered. Beth sat beside him, her eyes scanning the faces of the team, knowing that some were still hesitant, even resistant to the new direction. Terry, who had once struggled with the changes, was speaking up again, his voice more confident this time. "I understand what we're trying to do here," Terry said, his tone firm but measured. "But I'm still concerned that we're letting too many things slip. People are starting to relax too much. I've noticed that some of the staff are becoming overly casual in their interactions with guests, and that's not what we're about." Robert listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. He had expected this kind of feedback. While the overall morale had improved, it was clear that the balance between warmth and professionalism was still something they hadn't fully mastered. "You're right, Terry," Robert said, nodding. "There's a fine line between warmth and professionalism. We've worked hard to build a culture where people feel valued, but we can't forget the standards that made this hotel great in the first place. We need to find a balance." Beth looked over at Robert, admiring his calm approach. He wasn't dismissing Terry's concerns, but he wasn't backing down either. He understood that the changes they were making were more than just surface-level adjustments. They were about building a new foundation, one that would require constant evaluation and improvement. The discussion continued for another hour as Robert and Beth worked with the team to find the right balance. They acknowledged that there would always be bumps along the way, especially when you were trying to shift a deeply ingrained culture. But the key was to keep the lines of communication open, to be willing to listen, and to stay committed to the vision they had set. In the following weeks, a few key adjustments were made. New training sessions focused specifically on maintaining professionalism while still embracing the hotel's core values of kindness and respect. The staff was reminded that while warmth and engagement were important, they could not compromise the high standards of service that guests expected from a five-star hotel. It wasn't just about being friendly, it was about making every guest feel important, without sacrificing the level of service that had made the Mitchell Grand synonymous with luxury. However, there were still moments when old habits threatened to resurface. One morning, a highly respected corporate client arrived for a long-term stay. He was a regular at the hotel, someone Robert had known for years. Yet when Emma, the front desk manager, greeted him, there was something off about her tone. It wasn't overt, but her attempt at friendliness didn't carry the warmth it should have. The client was pleasant enough, but Robert could tell that he noticed the difference. As he walked away, Robert exchanged a brief glance with Beth, who was standing nearby. "I saw that," Beth said quietly. Robert nodded, his face serious. "It's frustrating. We're doing all the right things, but the smallest slip-up can undo everything." Later that day, Robert called Emma into his office. As expected, she appeared nervous but determined, a flicker of guilt passing over her features as she sat down across from him. "Emma," Robert began, his tone gentle but direct, "I noticed your interaction with Mr. Lawson this morning. It seemed off. Can you tell me what happened?" Emma took a deep breath, clearly trying to find the right words. "I don't know, sir. It's just, he's been here so many times, and I thought I had it down, you know? But I guess I was just trying too hard to be friendly, and it came across wrong." Robert smiled softly. "I get it. But remember, it's not about trying too hard. It's about being genuine. Our guests can tell when we're being authentic. It's okay to show warmth, but it has to come from a place of sincerity, not obligation." Emma nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing. "I'll do better. I didn't mean to give the wrong impression." Robert's gaze softened. "I know you didn't. We're all in this together, and every mistake is an opportunity to learn. But we can't lose sight of our core values. The warmth, the professionalism, it's all part of the experience we offer." After Emma left the office, Robert turned to Beth, who had been quietly observing. "It's a constant process," he said, rubbing his temples. "I thought we were further along than this." Beth placed a hand on his arm, offering a reassuring smile. "We are. These moments, these small corrections, they're part of the journey. We've already made such incredible progress. We can't expect perfection overnight. Robert nodded, taking a deep breath. You're right. We've got to keep moving forward. The changes are happening, even if they're not always as visible as we'd like. Beth smiled, a quiet sense of pride in her expression. One step at a time, Robert. We're building something lasting. As they stood together, looking out over the bustling hotel lobby, it was clear that while the road ahead would continue to present challenges, they were on the right path. The transformation they had started was real, and the Mitchell Grand Hotel was becoming more than just a place of luxury. It was becoming a place where every guest and every employee felt truly seen and valued. Months into their transformation, Robert and Beth stood at a pivotal point. The changes they had worked so hard to implement at the Mitchell Grand Hotel were starting to show, but maintaining those changes was an entirely different challenge. The culture shift wasn't just about educating the staff or changing the hotel's image. It was about creating a sustainable environment where respect, kindness, and inclusivity were always at the forefront, no matter what. Robert had spent countless hours meeting with his team, ensuring that they not only understood the changes, but also believed in them. He and Beth had worked side by side to reinforce the message at every level of the hotel, from the front desk to the kitchens, but they both knew that they couldn't do it alone. This transformation had to be embraced by every employee. One afternoon, as Robert and Beth walked through the hotel, they paused in front of the reception desk, watching the interactions between the staff and the guests. There was a noticeable difference compared to when they had first arrived. Guests were greeted with warm smiles, and even the briefest exchanges carried a sense of genuine connection. The staff, while still learning, were beginning to embody the values Robert and Beth had set forth. But Robert couldn't help but notice the subtle ways in which old habits still crept in. Things are better, Beth said, her voice quiet but filled with pride. But there's still work to be done. We've made progress, but some people are still holding on to the old ways. They're more reluctant to change than I thought. Robert nodded, his expression thoughtful. I see it too. But change takes time. We've come a long way, and I believe we'll get there. It's about keeping this momentum going. The challenge now is consistency. They had already seen incredible improvements in service and staff morale. But Robert understood that maintaining the hotel's new values in the long term would be their biggest test yet. Keeping the standards high, ensuring everyone felt heard and valued, these were the goals they now had to meet every day. As the weeks went by, Robert and Beth worked tirelessly to keep the momentum alive. They held more regular meetings with department heads, emphasizing the importance of reinforcing the values they had established. They also began introducing feedback loops, where employees could anonymously submit their thoughts and experiences regarding the changes. This would give them a clear idea of where things were improving and where more attention was needed. Despite the continued progress, the challenges were never far behind. One particular moment came to light when the hotel hosted an international conference. The event was large, and the guest list included influential figures from around the world. This brought an entirely new level of scrutiny, and suddenly the pressure to maintain a flawless image was greater than ever. During the conference, a situation occurred that tested the boundaries of the hotel's new values. A guest, a wealthy entrepreneur, made a scene at the front desk. He was visibly frustrated, demanding immediate attention from the management after a minor mix-up with his reservation. His tone was condescending, and he directed harsh words toward the receptionist, Claire. Claire, despite all the training she had undergone, faltered under the pressure of his attitude. She hesitated, struggling to balance politeness with the respect she was supposed to uphold. Beth, who had been walking by, witnessed the exchange. She immediately stepped in, her voice calm but firm. Sir, I understand your frustration, but please remember that everyone here is doing their best to ensure your experience is exceptional. We value your business, but we also expect respect for our staff. The guest, now flustered, grumbled something under his breath but eventually calmed down, recognizing that he wouldn't be able to push his way through this situation. Beth turned to Claire after the guest left, her face serious. You handled it well, but you were shaken, Beth said gently. Remember, you don't have to tolerate disrespect from anyone, no matter how important they seem. Claire nodded, still processing the incident. I felt like I didn't have control in that moment. I was afraid if I didn't meet his demands immediately, it would reflect poorly on the hotel. That's exactly why we're doing this, Beth said with a soft smile. It's not just about saying yes to every guest. It's about showing them that their value doesn't diminish someone else's. You deserve respect just as much as they do. It was moments like this, Beth realized, that truly tested the resilience of the culture they were trying to build. It wasn't always about grand gestures or high-profile guests. Sometimes it was in the quiet, everyday moments where the real work happened. Every instance of holding the line, of teaching both staff and guests the true meaning of respect, was what made the hotel's transformation more than just a set of policies. It made it a lived experience. As Robert and Beth reflected on the incident later that evening, they realized that the journey was far from over. "We've made a lot of progress," Robert said, his voice full of resolve. "But these moments show us that we can never stop. We can't take our foot off the pedal, no matter how far we've come." Beth agreed, her eyes steady with determination. "It's the consistency that will make this last. We can't let our guard down, not even for a second." With that, they both knew that the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but they were more committed than ever to ensuring the changes they had started would last. The Mitchell Grand wasn't just becoming a luxury hotel. It was becoming a place where respect, kindness, and genuine human connection were at the core of everything they did. As the months rolled by, the Mitchell Grand Hotel had evolved into something unrecognizable from its former self. The changes Robert and Beth had fought for were not just visible, they were tangible. The atmosphere of the hotel had transformed into one of warmth, inclusivity, and genuine care. Staff were more engaged, guests more appreciative, and the overall energy of the hotel felt different. But despite the evident progress, there were still moments that tested their resolve. One of the biggest challenges they faced was ensuring that the new culture didn't slip into complacency. The hotel's reputation had improved, and so had the bottom line. But Robert and Beth knew that sustaining this change required constant attention. The systems they had implemented, the feedback loops, the training, and the new policies, they were all necessary, but they needed to evolve continuously. It was not enough to simply introduce these concepts. They needed to become second nature to every member of the team. Beth had noticed it first, as she spent her mornings walking the halls of the hotel, observing both the staff and the guests. While the front desk employees were mostly on top of things, she observed subtle lapses in attention among some of the housekeeping staff. There were still moments when the level of care wasn't where it should be, especially with guests who seemed less important in the eyes of some staff members. It wasn't intentional, but it was a reminder that the battle against bias and assumptions wasn't over. It was ongoing. One day, while touring the guest floors, Beth stopped at the cleaning supply closet and overheard a conversation between two housekeepers. They were discussing a recent guest, a woman who had been staying at the hotel for a week. The housekeepers were debating whether she was the type who deserved extra care. Beth's heart sank as she listened to the conversation, but she knew she couldn't just let it slide. She approached the staff members, her voice calm but firm. "We treat every guest the same," she said, "no matter who they are or how they look. Each person is important, and we show that through our actions. If you wouldn't treat someone like this in your own home, don't treat them like this here." The two housekeepers fell silent, clearly taken aback by her words. Beth wasn't angry, but she was resolute. These small moments were the ones that could undermine everything they were trying to build. Beth's conversation with the housekeepers lingered in her mind as she walked back down the hallway. It was moments like that, small, seemingly insignificant interactions, that were the true test of their progress. Changing a hotel's culture wasn't just about the big moments, the gala events, the VIP guests, or the media attention. It was about the everyday experiences, the unnoticed actions, and how everyone at the hotel treated each other and the guests in the quiet moments. That afternoon, Robert sat down with her in his office, and she shared what had happened. His expression grew serious as she relayed the conversation. "We've come so far," Robert said, his voice thoughtful, "but this shows that we still have work to do. It's not enough to make these changes on paper. They need to be part of every single person's mindset." Beth nodded. "Exactly. It's about reinforcing the idea that respect is something we show every day, to everyone. We can't afford to let old habits creep back in, especially when it's the small stuff. Robert stood and walked to the window, looking out over the hotel grounds. You're right. It's easy to get complacent once things start to look good. But I'm not letting this slip. I'll have another round of meetings with the leadership team. We need to re-emphasize that every single guest, no matter who they are, should be treated with the same level of care. Beth watched him, admiring his determination. This was one of the reasons why she had fallen in love with him. He was committed to their shared vision, not just for the hotel, but for the kind of impact they wanted to have on the world. What do you think about opening up some of those meetings to the entire staff? Not just leadership? Everyone needs to hear this. Robert turned to face her, a slow smile spreading across his face. I think that's a great idea. Let's get everyone involved, not just the managers. If we want to create a culture, we need to include everyone in that conversation. It's not just the leadership team that sets the tone. It's everyone, all the way down to the housekeeping staff. Beth felt a spark of hope. This was the kind of commitment that would make the changes stick. It wasn't about enforcement or control. It was about creating a shared responsibility. Every person in the hotel would have a hand in shaping its future. As they discussed further plans, their determination grew stronger. They knew that sustaining this new culture would take effort, but they were both more certain than ever that it was worth it. The hotel was no longer just a place of luxury and exclusivity. It was becoming a place where everyone, guest and employee alike, could feel respected and valued. Later that week, Robert and Beth held a series of open meetings with the entire staff. The energy in the room was different from past gatherings, more engaged, more open. Employees were eager to discuss what was working and what needed improvement. For the first time, it felt like every single person at the Mitchell Grand was part of something larger than themselves, part of a movement that was reshaping the way luxury hotels treated people. As the meetings wrapped up, Robert stood and addressed the group one last time. The work doesn't stop here. We've made incredible strides, but we're only just beginning. Let's keep pushing forward, together. Beth looked around the room at the faces of the staff, some still hesitant, others full of newfound pride. It was clear that the journey was ongoing, but for the first time in a long time, she felt confident that they were on the right path. The Mitchell Grand Hotel was becoming more than just a hotel. It was becoming a place where people didn't just stay, but where they felt truly seen. As the Mitchell Grand Hotel continued to thrive, Robert and Beth found themselves standing at a crossroads. The culture shift they had worked so hard to implement had taken root, but sustaining it over the long term was still a daunting task. The feedback loop they had established with staff had proven effective, but they both knew that the true measure of success wasn't just in the positive reviews or improved employee morale. It was in the lasting, organic change that would outlast them. Beth had spent hours working with department heads to refine their practices, ensuring that every team member not only understood the vision, but was living it day in and day out. The changes were beginning to feel second nature to many of the staff, and the culture of inclusivity and respect was more than just a policy. It was becoming embedded in the hotel's DNA. Still, the question that weighed on their minds was, how do we keep this going? One evening, as they sat in Robert's office overlooking the glowing city lights, Beth reflected on how far they had come. Do you remember the first day we walked into this place? She asked softly. It feels like a lifetime ago. Robert smiled, his eyes momentarily distant as he recalled the hotel's early days. I remember. We knew it was going to be a challenge, but we also knew it was worth fighting for. Beth nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the desk. We've made so much progress, but there's still so much more to do. We've changed the way the staff interacts with guests, but how do we ensure that the culture stays true to its roots? How do we ensure that this becomes something real and lasting, not just a fleeting moment? Robert leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words settling in. I think it's about consistency. We've built something great, but we have to keep it alive. It's not enough to just have a culture of respect. It's about teaching people to lead with that same respect, to pass it on to the next generation of staff, to make sure that this becomes the standard, not just a trend. It was a moment of realization. They had built something remarkable, but the real test would be in how they could maintain it, how they could make it last. And that meant continuously nurturing the values they had planted, ensuring that everyone, from leadership to new hires, understood and embraced the foundation they had created. The following weeks brought new challenges and decisions that would shape the future of the Mitchell Grand Hotel. Robert and Beth were determined not to let the momentum slip. They began drafting a new training program that would be mandatory for every new hire, ensuring that the hotel's core values would be instilled from day one. It was a move to safeguard the legacy they had created, ensuring that the culture of respect and kindness would survive beyond their leadership. One of the most significant changes was the implementation of a mentorship program. Senior staff members who had embraced the changes were encouraged to mentor new hires, guiding them not just in the technical aspects of their roles, but also in how to embody the hotel's values. It was a move that gave staff more ownership over the hotel's success and empowered them to carry the culture forward. As Robert and Beth continued to make strides with their internal processes, they were met with an unexpected turn of events. During an annual review, the board of directors proposed expanding the Mitchell Grand into a chain of luxury hotels. While this had always been a long-term goal for Robert, it now felt like the moment had arrived. The proposition was a clear sign of their success. The reputation of the hotel had grown, and investors were beginning to take notice. However, with growth came complexity. Robert and Beth both knew that expanding too quickly could risk the very culture they had fought to build. The hotel's success had always been about its unique identity, a place where every guest was treated with warmth and dignity, where the staff truly cared. Could they replicate that in multiple locations, or would the culture be lost as they scaled? Beth looked at Robert one evening, her eyes filled with the same determination that had driven them from the beginning. If we do this, we have to make sure that every new hotel feels like the Mitchell Grand. It can't just be about luxury. It has to be about what we stand for. Robert nodded, a quiet resolve settling in. We'll do it on our terms. We're not just building hotels, we're building communities of respect. We'll take this slow, be mindful, and make sure every new property embraces the same values. Together, they made the decision to move forward with the expansion, but with caution. They would build their brand carefully, ensuring that each new location reflected the same commitment to humanity that had defined the Mitchell Grand. As the first new property was being planned, Robert and Beth stood in the original hotel's lobby, looking around at the staff and guests. It had been a long road, but they had done it. They had created a place where people felt valued, where true change had taken root. "This is just the beginning," Robert said, his voice filled with pride. Beth smiled, looking around at the team that had worked so hard alongside them. "Yes, it is. And I can't wait to see what we build next." And with that, the future of the Mitchell Grand and the new chain felt secure, rooted in respect, warmth, and the shared vision of making the world a better place, one guest at a time.